Thank you. It is on.
You're on.
Thank you, John.
All right, it is time for us to get started. We're in Genesis 38 is where we're going to start. Genesis 38. And I will tell you, Joe and I were talking a little bit this morning before we got here. We have a lot of ground to cover today.
So we'll be putting up Edwin's phone number and email account if there's any complaints.
I have his personal cell phone number if you'd like to complain directly. That would be fantastic. Let's start off with a prayer, and then let's jump into our text together. Jonathan, I think I gave you a mic. Will you lead us in prayer?
God and our Father in heaven, we are humbled to be in your presence this morning and so happy to be together and to be able to worship you. Father, we pray that as we study this morning that you'll be with Terry and Joe as they open up your word to us. And Father, we know that your word is rich. There's so much in it and so much we can learn. We ask that you help us to have an open heart and an open mind and to learn lessons from your word that we need in our lives. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Okay, so this is interesting how the structure of Genesis kind of moves forward here, because we're introduced to Joseph in chapter 37, and then in chapter 38 we have this Judah-Tamar story, kind of like an interlude of sorts. And it seems a little bit odd, but the first thing I want to remind you of is that even though we call Genesis 37 through 50 a lot of times the Joseph narrative, Moses actually says in Genesis 37 verse 2, it's the story of Jacob. It's the story of Jacob's family. And so while it focuses on the character Joseph, it's really about Jacob's family and how Jacob's family is going to proceed in the fulfillment of these promises. Joseph just becomes kind of a central thematic character to that point, and I think we understand why that is. It's also a fitting interlude because this gives time in the story. It seems chronologically to fit. It allows time for Joseph to get to Egypt, to, I hate to use the word established when you're a slave, but I guess somewhat established in Egypt. But it also kind of brings up Judah, who is the son of promise of Jacob. He's the one who's going to get the blessing. And it's important. We're going to see Judah moments throughout, and those are important to kind of understand. And along with that is what we call redemption arcs. We touched on this a little bit when we talk about people's brokenness and God's transformation. That's really what a redemption arc is, by the way. A narrative arc where a character, often one with negative traits or past transgressions, transforms, becomes a better version of themselves, typically through a heroic act or sacrifice. Let's just make sure we understand this. We all have redemption arcs. Our stories are redemption arcs.
Hopefully so. Yeah.
Hopefully so.
Yeah.
Hopefully we're becoming better versions of ourselves and being transformed. That's the hope. And I said most, if not all, characters are presented with a redemption arc. And part of the issue with that character is, the reason I say most, if not all, somebody like Melchizedek doesn't really have a redemption arc. There's a lot of people introduced that I don't know that we could call them characters, like Enoch, right? Because Enoch is, we get a snippet of Enoch. We don't really get much of Enoch. And there's a couple of, outside of Genesis, there's a couple of people that don't really have redemption arcs. I would think Daniel, Boaz, Ruth. Those are some that stick out. I will tell you that Abigail, if you look at the entire Old Testament, women are far less likely to have a redemption arc than men when you look into the stories gender-based. So we've seen this a little bit. One of those is Reuben, who sleeps with his father's concubine, right? And that's bad. But then he keeps Joseph from being killed, so that's good. And we start to see that redemption arc.
Going to that, but it is interesting as well that once he comes to the point that he enters his redemption arc, his influence arc starts really dropping. Because the previous chapter, who do the brothers really listen to at the end of the day?
Judah. He's also missing when that happens, which is key.
Yeah.
So today's opening plays an important point in the redemption arc of Judah, which actually, when we kind of really start to look at him, is what Joe just talked about in chapter 37, verse 26. His first transgression we see is selling Joseph to the Midianites. And then the opening of this chapter, we'll talk about in a minute, he lives as a Canaanite. He leaves his father's house and he becomes, for essentially what we would describe, a Canaanite in his practice and behavior. Then we have this story of Tamar, which contains what I would think may be the turning point. Now, for Jacob, you think about the turning point for Jacob is the night he wrestles with the angel. We see a drastic turn after that moment. With Abraham, it's probably Mount Moriah. We see at least that's the hallmark moment. But here we can see the turn begins with she's more righteous than I. And then what happens is he's a vocal leader in the interchange with Joseph coming up in chapter 44. He offers himself, and think about this, he's the one who sells Joseph into slavery essentially. He offers himself as essentially the ransom for Benjamin. Keep me instead. And so we see that's kind of his shining moment. And then, of course, this is kind of culminated with the blessing where he becomes the son of promise. Jacob's blessing in chapter 49.
Wouldn't you say at this point, a big part of that maybe doesn't get brought out obviously, or doesn't get brought out frequently, is that his love for his father grows between these two. And so he starts off and he has a disregard, and we could say a hate for his father, because he's willing to be a part of this episode of destroying his father's life the way his father looks at it by Joseph.
It's a hate for his brother that is a hate for his father.
Exactly. And so there's some other growth that should be pointed out about.
One of the reasons this is important is because we get so tied into the story of Joseph that we'll miss these things if we're not careful. We'll miss the character thread of Judah woven throughout, and we'll miss what's going on. And so that's why I want to make sure we see those redemption arcs there as we go through. And they're important because Judah's going to become, he's in the lineage of Jesus. And so that's why this is all important. So I just want to point that out as we kind of get started. We're going to start here with this idea of really Judah and Canaan. And who does Judah marry?
Canaanite woman.
Yeah, we don't have a name. She's unnamed.
Yeah.
All we know is that she's a Canaanite woman. What's wrong with this picture? Okay.
Canaanite people are cursed.
Yeah.
I mean, by Noah.
Okay.
Pretty much, So.
I think one of the things that's really interesting for me is how many of the things in especially chapter 38, we may be tempted to connect to the law of Moses,
Which doesn't exist.
which doesn't exist when these events happen. So, yes, there's the curse of Canaan in the days of Noah. There's that part. We may not know whether Judah knows that or not. We see here, and our first thought is, well, they were told not to marry the Canaanites. Well, yes, their descendants were. We don't have a record that they were. And that's going to even apply to this story and the idea of levirate marriage. We're going to think, well, this is all outlined by Moses. Well, it is, but that's after the fact of what happens in this story. So all of that's interesting. And by the way, levirate marriages, we'll talk about it in a moment.
And Moses hadn't been born he's going to be born
several
hundred, yeah.
Mm-hmm. But there is a lesson here, I think, for the people that are receiving this narrative, the story from Moses, this is kind of a warning. Here's what happens when you don't listen to the warning to intermarry with Canaan. Here's the wickedness. Because what happens here in this is, what kind of sons does he have? Wicked. So wicked that Tamar's husband, his oldest, what does it say happens to him?
Killed him.
God punishes him by taking his life. We don't know what he did. We just know that he's wicked. And it's fairly interesting just to read through this story and think about, there's this glaring warning. This is why you don't marry the people of Canaan, right? Because this is how wicked his sons become. And so that's pretty interesting as well. So in the death of a son where there's no heir, there is what we call levirate marriage. And, when I was a kid, I always attached that to Levi. It has nothing to do with that. The Latin word involved here means brother-in-law, basically, or in-law. That's where the word comes from. So there is this expectation that then Er's brother Onan is going to then provide a heir with Tamar. And that actually, by the way, is a betrothment that is set up. It's like a marriage in that sense, that then Onan has to take on Tamar as essentially a wife until he provides this heir, and the heir is then old enough to take care of his mother, then that could, but that's part of the, when you're a single woman in this culture, you either have to be provided for by your family or provided for by your husband, or in your husband's death, a son, or you essentially become a prostitute, is basically what happens. It's so interesting culturally.
Is there also this financial aspect of it, that the firstborn is generally the one that's blessed?
Well, that's going to figure into Onan's decision.
Yeah, his decision, so, right.
And I think that's the thing, that when we see that Onan just doesn't want to give a child to Tamar, that's not really what the cause is there. When he purposely is not conceiving a child with her, it is because if he knows if Er never has a son, then the double blessing comes to Onan. He gets twice as much as he would have gotten otherwise. So you're right. The motivation for this is financial.
And God calls that wicked. We
Correct.
don't know anything else about his life other than
Correct.
That's the decision that he makes. Well, other than God punishes him.
And here's the other interesting thing. In the law of Moses, and we don't have time to go read this, but it comes to levirate marriage in the law of Moses, a brother who chooses not to fulfill his obligation is put to public shame. And so that's interesting as well. By the way, what other story in the Bible is well known that is a practice of maybe levirate marriage besides this one? Ruth. And here's what's entertaining about both of these stories. They're really the only detailed stories, besides when Jesus asked the question about how many, at the woman at the well, which one's your husband? Mm-hmm. Neither Ruth's story nor this story follow Moses' instructions the way they're written. Because it's in both stories, it's not the first relative that provides the heir. So it's pretty interesting to think about that.
And both times we don't have an Israelite woman involved in.
Yes, both times it's not an Israelite woman. Now, levirate marriage, by the way, good thing to point out here, is not just an Israelite custom. This is an ancient Near Eastern custom. And in some of the ancient Near Eastern cultures, by the way, it wasn't just the brothers that could provide an heir, but very important to this story, the father-in-law could provide the heir as well. But the law of Moses would consider what happens here to be incestuous. But in other cultures, it would not be. And we know this about Tamar. She's not a Jew, from what we can tell. She's a Canaanite woman as well. So, and by the way, this thing with Judah, up to this point, all of the patriarchs have gone back home to the family to get a wife. And this is one of the first times where we see this quote going outside of the family to get a wife, which is pretty interesting as well. So all that stuff is kind of intriguing.
Yeah. But that definitely happens to Joseph as well.
Joseph is going to,
well outside
absolutely.
of it.
Joseph marries an Egyptian, and that's we'll get into that here in a little bit as well.
The daughter of a sun priest.
Daughter of a sun priest, and absolutely. So we've already talked about this question about the intermarrying. Let's talk about Tamar's trickery, because what happens is Onan dies, and he's judged by God as well for being wicked. And then essentially, we go back to this protection and providence has to be from your family, your husband's family, your own family, or you're doomed to a life of immorality, essentially, is the only way you're going to be able to provide for yourself. So there comes a point where Judah says, my son's too young, I'm not going to give him to you in marriage yet. Go back to your father-in-law's house until I call for you. Now, that's not really a fair dealing with her, by the way, because Judah could have released her and she could have gone and found another husband. But as it is, he puts the burden of providing for her on her father while also promising her, betrothing her to his youngest son, which then means she cannot marry anybody else. So she's kind of stuck. I don't think we get that.
And he doesn't have any intention.
He has no intention of giving her to his son. I mean, and whatever reason that is, I mean, we could think whatever. We don't really know outside of maybe she's just bad luck because he's lost both sons that are married to her, right? So it's interesting in this question. It's interesting its location in the text because Moses' instructions haven't happened yet. So we kind of see, just to say that so we can move along a little bit. How do these actions of Jacob connect to Esau's actions in Genesis 25? That was a question in your book, which is a great question. Now, let me get to where that's at, because she goes and she puts on the garments and looks like a prostitute and covers herself. And he's out shearing sheep. Now, big part of this lost on us culturally. Sheep shearing was a big party. Okay? You'd go shear sheep, and then you'd go party at night, and there's a lot of drinking and those kind of things involved in this. So this is again where we read he's going out to sheep shear, and we think, well,
It's the same thing with harvesting. Like,
oh yeah,
like when
harvesting,
you've got Boaz, he makes his heart merry, which is the Bible way of saying he drank a bunch of wine,
right?
And then he falls asleep, and we know the rest of the story.
So this festival, this partying is all part of that. Did you have your hand? Okay. So he sees this woman on the side of the road. He propositions her, for lack of a better term. She asks for payment. You see her shrewdness. He promises a goat. She says, no, I'll take instead these three things from you. What were the three things? Signet ring? Huh?
Signet, cord, and the staff.
Right. And a lot of times the signet would be on the cord around his neck. But these three things are important. Also, they display his wealth. The fact that he has a signet means he's wealthy. Okay? But these are basically the equivalent to her saying, give me all your credit cards.
Yeah.
And your ID. Okay?
And essentially raising your status to his level because you have the
As
stuff.
long as you have
As long
that
as you
stuff.
have the stuff. Right.
Yeah. Okay? And this is where you see again in this redemption arc just Judah's brokenness, because he's like, okay. Now, how does that connect to Esau's actions? That's a thing.
What I want, when I want.
Okay?
You know, it's almost a, like a better term, a desperation, because it's what I want now.
Okay? And why? And what else is involved in this besides just what I want now? Why do they want it?
Carnal.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
no, you're right. It's flesh. It's flesh driven. They're making decisions of the flesh in a fleshly moment. I'm so hungry I could die. What good is this birthright to me? Just take it. And here it's his wife has died. It's a different appetite than food, but he is so hungry in that sense that what good are these things to me? Take it, and I'll come back and bring you a goat and get my stuff back. And so both of them let the flesh dominate. I've got to move on a little quicker here. So then he sends his buddy. By the way, isn't it interesting he sends his buddy out to make the payment? Okay, something to that. Let me tell you something else that's here that we don't get necessarily. One of the things that shows up here is, in this story, is initially she is a shrine prostitute. But then when it comes out what she's done, the word that they use is harlot. And now think about that. And this is something we need to understand. When Judah participates in the immoral act, it's a shrine prostitute. It's almost like a form of worship. When she participates in it, she's a harlot. Moses is trying to get us to see the hypocrisy here, right? Because then when it comes out she's pregnant and she's been out there being a harlot, what does Judah say?
Bring her and burn her.
Burn her. Okay. Again, this is where you know the law of Moses is not in place yet, because that's not what should happen to the law of Moses.
Except to a priest daughter.
Except to a priest's daughter.
Yeah, and then the rest of the family, she gets stoned.
Right. And he does
And
too.
he does too, yeah.
He does too.
Right.
That's the
Or
important part.
ideally he does
Yeah,
too, but
yeah. If you know who he is, he gets stoned as well. Okay? So that's the hypocrisy in all of this. And that's when she says, I got your driver's license and credit cards. Right? And exposes him. And he says that she's more righteous than I am. So, what do you think about that? Is that God's judgment about her? Okay. Judah's judgment? Anybody else?
Really, neither of them acted righteously.
Okay.
I don't see that as being God's judgment. They were both guilty.
Okay.
if you measure by degree, then he's certainly accurate.
It's a relativity.
It's a relative thing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's just not. We want to make sure we don't read into the text that these are the words of God saying that she's now righteous because she, by treachery, she gets what is rightfully hers. I mean, he's wrong all the way down the line, and she's right from a fundamental standpoint that I'm being denied the thing that is my right by God.
And she's also the only one in this story that is tied into the idea of making sure there's an heir for Judah, which is important because this is the bloodline of the Messiah. Now, she doesn't know that, but she's more interested in providing the lineage of Jacob through Judah than Judah is at this point, which also goes back to the broken relationship with the father at that moment.
And which speaks to one of Matthew's purposes is to show the brokenness of the lineage of Jesus. Because
Correct.
all these characters, Perez is in the
Correct.
lineage. And so
Yep, absolutely.
showing our desperate need for the Savior. And he does
Correct.
some other things. He makes this thing out of 14s and things of that nature. But we shouldn't nerd out on that. We don't have time.
What's really interesting here, too, is just to point out that God uses an immoral situation all the way around. All of chapter 38 is sinful. And yet the Messiah still is produced through this story. And I think that's an important thing to say. Even our bad behavior cannot thwart God's plan.
And Judah is brought he's brought into a place where his arc starts going.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
This is where I think this statement about her righteousness is where his arc takes the turn and begins the redemption arc, the transformation. And so, absolutely, that's what's happening here in this story. And that's why Genesis 38 is in there, is for us to see that and to see the change in Judah and to be able to see what God does and how God works not only in Judah's life from this point forward, obviously, but he also works through Jacob's house to bring about Jesus. All of that is in this story, in a story that otherwise is an awful story from everything. Now, I think the other thing, let's see here real quick. You already talked about this. Perez is in the lineage. And one of the things we don't have time to get into, we could nerd out a lot about, is in this Perez story, there is this repetitive theme in Genesis 2 about the younger overpowering the older, right? That shows up too because he sticks his hand out first, even though
Actually, his brother, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so the brother's born first, but because his hand came out first, he's technically the oldest. And so you have the same thing going on there. Okay, so any questions about 38 before we get to 39? We're going to talk about Potiphar's wife here. Okay. Why did And this is where, we got about 20 minutes left, so we're gonna skip over some of the points that are more well known probably here. But why does Joseph refuse to sin with Potiphar's wife?
She was Potiphar's wife.
Okay, one reason is she's Potiphar's wife, and Potiphar has trusted her. So there's this idea of he can't sin against Potiphar is implied in his language there. What else? Yeah, he can't sin against God. And we don't know how much time, by the way, has transpired truthfully in all of this story. But what we're starting to see is Joseph's hero arc come into play with this decision pretty clearly.
Yeah.
I know we don't have a lot of time, but what's important to me, or what is amazing, is he is sold into slavery, and now he's at this point. Some time has passed, but he hadn't forgot who God is.
Correct.
He hasn't.
Hasn't forgot who God is.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
And which means, by the way, we may talk about how bad of a dad Jacob is, but there is a foundational knowledge here. There's no doubt about that. And also, by the way, part of this is, I think we could see just humanity and even our nature. When you hit your lowest is when you remember God. I've had some of our at other places, a couple of members that have gone to jail for a few things, and I will just tell you that, and you do work at the jail. One of the things that probably can be discouraging is not everybody, but most people want to turn to God during jail. The hard part's when they get out, right? And so there's a little bit of that going on here, I think, as well. But the foundation is there for sure, and he knows who God is, and he serves God. One of the things you can't get into is Joseph is beautiful. I've said this before. One of the worst things to be said about you in the Old Testament is that you're beautiful, because bad things happen to beautiful people if you just look at that thread. Amnon and Tamar is another one of those situations later on during the days of the kings.
So strive to be ugly.
Strive to be ugly. At least, I mean, think about it. Sarah's so beautiful that two different men try to take her away from Abraham. I mean, being pretty is a curse, right? Absalom, he dies because of his beautiful hair. I mean, again, that's another nerdy thread we could get into, but we don't have time to go down that too much. What's the result of Joseph's faithfulness? So he says, I can't do this against God. By the way, obviously, I think the way that mirrors how we avoid sin is we don't mistreat others, we love everybody else, and we don't sin against God. And there has to be a foundational knowledge to know what that is.
And that's what he just described the cross.
Yeah.
He just described
It's
what
the
Jesus said.
cruciformity.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what God has wanted all along, and that's what he lives up to at this moment.
And for those who don't remember, the cross forms the vertical relationship with God and the horizontal relationship with man, and cross-shaped living. And so we see that is here. What's the result of this faithfulness?
Prison.
Yeah.
One time Eric remembers his mic. Prison. Boom. Mic drop. Goes to prison. Because he's a slave and she's the wife of basically Potiphar. We're not talking about this. He's the head of the Secret Service, for lack of a better term, right? So who you gonna believe? This Hebrew slave or this rich nobleman's wife? You're gonna believe the nobleman's wife, and she's got his garment, right? So you have this going on here, and he goes to prison for that. How is Joseph? This was a question we had that I put together. 8 and 11 go together. How is Joseph in Potiphar's house a microcosmic, I don't even know if that's the right word, fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham? How's that a fulfillment of God's promise in Genesis 12? This question was asked twice, and the answer is basically the same. The other one is in prison. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I saw it as, Joseph is sold into slavery, right? And obviously Israel goes into slavery in Egypt. And, hold on, let me get this. So Joseph is sold into slavery into Potiphar's house. He does well, but ultimately
ultimately he's second in command. So he's given all these blessings and everything else. So you see that similarity there in regards to that.
Anybody else have thoughts?
Verse 3, we had the promise to Abraham, I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you.
Right.
In 39:3, his master saw that the Lord was with him. The Lord caused all he did to succeed.
Okay.
He saw that the Lord was with him and promoted him and received blessings, just as God had promised Abraham he would do for his family.
Right. I think the other thing is that what you see too is a smaller version of the nations being blessed by the seed of Abraham. The people that really get blessed in these stories aren't Joseph necessarily.
It's Potiphar.
It's Potiphar.
And then it's the jailer.
And then it's the jailer. And later on it's
And
going
then
to be Pharaoh.
Pharaoh.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so what you see is you see Joseph suffering, but the nation around him being blessed, which, by the way, the fulfillment of the seed promise is one who's going to come to suffer to bless all the nations. And so this is, all these layers is why we talk about Joseph being such a type of Jesus. They're just seen over and over again. And then we have the prison dreams. Okay, so we get into the prison dreams. We got the butler, the baker. We're not going to get into the dreams themselves. Hopefully you read those and you know those. But one of the things that's important here is, who does Joseph give credit for the interpretation of the dreams? God.
Yeah. He says God's the only one who can
God's
interpret.
the only one who can interpret dreams. It's God that can do that. How did the cupbearer, so he interprets their dreams. By the way, little typography here, or typology here. You've got Joseph with 2 criminals.
3 days.
3 days. One criminal is restored or saved. One criminal perishes. And then Joseph eventually will be released and have new life. So sounds a lot like somebody else,
And
right?
he's in a pit,
He's
which
in a pit.
is similar to being in
a tomb.
tomb.
Correct. So how does he reward the dream of Joseph? What?
He
For how long? 2 years. This is one of those parts of the story where I'm like, you imagine sitting there for 2 years and you did this and this guy doesn't even remember who you are and he made this promise? 2 years.
He remembered to benefit himself.
Correct. Yeah, he remembers to benefit himself. And so eventually he remembers when Pharaoh has dreams. Oh yeah, there's this guy. I got a guy,
Yeah.
right?
And he's still lifting himself up.
Yeah, I got a guy.
Yeah.
I got a guy for you. Look at what I can provide for you. He still lifted himself up in Pharaoh. What are the dreams? What are the dreams that Pharaoh has?
Fat cow, skinny cow eats fat cow.
His cat, okay.
Corn,
Told as only a rancher could tell it. Yeah.
anyway, corn, the stalks, 7
Yep.
years.
7 years that were good. 7 years full of blight.
Exactly. So he's talking about good years, 7 good years, and then famine arises after that, and better store up.
Okay. So, by the way, those are weird dreams. Right? I think we could all agree.
You
Cows
might,
don't eat cows.
you might remember that dream if
Yeah,
you
you
woke
might
up.
remember that dream. Remember too that cows are sacred in Egypt. I think that's a thing to kind of remember.
A
So
lot of animals.
a lot of animals.
Cats,
Yeah.
crocodiles or alligators, whatever they
Yeah.
are in the Nile.
Who does Joseph credit for the interpretation of dreams here? It's important to keep in mind. He is what we see post Genesis 38 while he's in Egypt is we see Joseph constantly lifting up God. We see him constantly praising and glorifying God. What is Joseph's advice to Pharaoh? What do the dreams mean? There's coming what?
Famine coming, you better store up. 7 years of plenty.
7 years that are going to be really good, and there's going to be 7 years of famine. So what's the advice?
Store it up.
Get somebody wise. Store it up.
Wise, watch over it, store it up.
Find somebody wise who can save, and he even gives a percentage. 20% of everything of the 7 good years, which I thought was interesting, right? Because just think, even during the famine, 20% is not going to be the same they get to keep during the good years. It's kind of interesting, if you do the math, you're like, well, I don't know if that math checks out. But it does, because that's going to be enough. You give 20%, stored away with a wise person, and then you'll be taken care of. And we know that essentially what we're going to learn is not only by doing this does Egypt be provided for, but they become a power in the region because they have storehouses that are full.
Now, yeah, but it's interesting here that Joseph, the slave,
Yeah.
now the servant, the slave,
Yep.
he winds up enslaving all of Egypt to
Correct.
Pharaoh.
Correct.
I mean, just as a side note of the.
Correct.
I mean, we're way that's down the.
So
down the
what
stream.
reward does he get? He's the wise guy, right? The wise man, would be a better way to say it. And he becomes second in command in all of Egypt. It sits at the right hand of Pharaoh. He then marries an Egyptian woman who's the daughter of a sun priest. And they have 2 kids named Manasseh and Ephraim. What does the name Manasseh mean?
God has made me forget all my hardship.
Okay, God has made me forget. So then what does Ephraim mean?
Well, since he stuck this in my face, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction.
All right. So we got these 2 names, right? One says that I've been able to forget, and one says that I have been made fruitful. Why are those names a good message for these people receiving this? I thought this was a really interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
These are wondering Jude.
Okay?
Message to the Israelites. I mean, you know, it's not exactly been easy to march around, I imagine, you know. So a lot of hardships endured in that, even though God's taking care of them. But, you know, God is taking care of them. So it makes me forget
Okay?
my hardships.
Yep. Jonathan?
I mean, this is the descendants of those who refused to forget Egypt.
Okay.
And those stories are probably still with them. That, I mean, part of the message that God has given them is you got to let go of that. Forget about it. You've been given plenty. You were made fruitful and bountiful coming out of that. Now let it go and let me provide for you.
Yep. I think those are all great comments. And if God can let Joseph forget and be fruitful in those terrible circumstances, how much more can he do that when you cross into a land flowing with milk and honey?
And you would see Joseph as a hero.
Yeah.
As generations down, you would definitely see him as a source of pride for your nation. And then you read his story, or you really don't read his story. You probably hear his story told over and over again from your parents, your grandparents, etc. But the first words out of his mouth are the name should go, okay, that's my story too.
Right.
There should be this identification with God. Even though he was put into these terrible positions of hardship, God said, "Here's the blessing that takes and take it away and change your mind, your outlook on life." And then the other part is, of course, the fruitfulness of the land. And who needs that story? It's the second generation going into the land. That this is what God's going to do for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Any questions, thoughts of that? I got more to share, but that's kind of towards the end of the lesson. We'll get to the parallels of Joseph and Jesus in just a moment. Any questions, comments, thoughts? One of the things that at this point I want to share with you is also Moses has created an intentional comparison between Judah and Joseph that we might overlook if we don't kind of look at the details. And the details matter on these things. Moses is pretty intentional about what he shares and how he shares it and what he says. So, for instance, the story opens with Judah going down to Adullam, and he has to examine the objects given to Tamar, if you remember, to recognize. And he gives into sensuality when he's with a prostitute, whereas Joseph is brought down to Egypt, so there's the parallel. Jacob is the one who recognizes Joseph's coat, presumes him to be dead back in Genesis 37, and so we see this this kind of wordplay going on, both using the same language to connect those. And Joseph rejects the sensuality of Potiphar's wife. And so what is going on here is there is this kind of connection and comparison. And what's interesting is they're both on these hero redemption arcs, okay? They're just being compared at the time and in different places of that. And it's just interesting to kind of see those comparisons intentional. Part of what allows us, by the way, and I don't know that we put this together unless we point it out, part of what allows us to really praise Joseph for what he does with Potiphar, besides just the common sense that it's immoral, is it follows a story where his brother doesn't make the right decision. You see this awful story, and then you see the right story that happens. And so Moses is intentionally contrasting these two stories in 38 and 39 to make sure these people can see those differences and understand them, and to really give Joseph that hero arc going forward, which is undeniable as we go forward. Now, there's going to be moments with Joseph that there's going to be questionable things. I mean, this marrying the Egyptian priest's daughter, there's some things that I think come through that more than likely. Some point he claims to practice divination, just like the Egyptians, and has a diviner's cup. And you can't help but think that that's been influenced by his father-in-law, who's a priest who practices divination. And so there's going to be those moments. That just means that, again, as we've said, they're real humans. They are just like us. They're going to have good moments and bad moments. But overall, there's certainly a heroic character going forward.
And we can't make a lot of it, but he does adopt the culture of his day in that they shaved himself completely.
He dresses like
an Egyptian.
Yeah.
Probably talks like an.
Probably walks.
There's a joke right in the middle of that, and I stepped right into it. Yeah. Unintentional.
We all flash back to the 80s with the Bengals real quick. Joseph and Jesus real quick. Both have to let's go through this. Both are tempted. Both are falsely accused and imprisoned. Both are presented between two criminals. One is restored, Butler Baker for Joseph, just so we know. Both come out of the earth, the pit of the tomb, to a new life, to resurrection in there. Both are exalted to the right hand of power as well. And so you have in these stories so many parallels, okay, that are undeniable between Joseph and Jesus. And Joseph is preparing to save his people in Egypt. That's what he's doing. He's the redeemer of them in the case of this famine. That's what he essentially becomes.
Yeah, but it is interesting that the Bible uses two characters, though, to define Jesus. And it never the Bible doesn't use Joseph in a direct way.
Doesn't.
Adam,
yep,
and then David, and that's
correct.
That's what Scripture says. So, but we're reading all this, and rightfully so. There's just too many similarities, but
too many connections that can be made to deny it, even though, and we might not say that they're types. We may be careful about the saying type, anti-type, although it seems there. But there's a lot of characters throughout the Old Testament that carry these kind of parallels and similarities to Jesus, because they're all pointing to Jesus. And they're all intentionally told in a way. These stories are being shared. I mean, the theme, really the main purpose of Genesis is to create this story for these people to know how they became who they are as they go establish what becomes the nation of Israel in the land of Canaan. But that's almost secondary to the primary part of this, which is this is the story of how Jesus comes. That's the primary story of all of Scripture. Not just Genesis, this is the story of the arrival of the Messiah. And so that's why stories like Judah and Tamar are also important, because they play a role in the arrival of the Messiah. Even in their sinfulness, it still occurs. And so that's why all these stories are going to show these connectivities and show these parallels, is that we're supposed to see the connection forward to Jesus. We're supposed to see the connection to the Messiah. And it's interesting to do that and to realize that we're supposed to see that, and when Jesus actually comes, none of them can see that.
Yeah. Well, and well before that, when we look at the Judaic line or look at all of his descendants, they become the kings.
Right.
Do the kings ever have sexual issues?
All of them do.
Do they have issues with foreign wives?
Yep.
Mostly, yeah.
Most
So
of them.
that's in their lineage, and that's part of their story, and they leap over it to get, and that's what makes Jesus, well, one of the many things that makes Jesus so amazing for us is that all these things that every character before him that's compared to him, they all have flaws and they all fall into these areas, and we need him because he's the one who doesn't.
Right.
And that's
you mentioned the kings. I mean, David is by far the best of all the kings. He still has 6 wives, right? But immediately after him, you have his son Solomon, who we consider to be a good king. And you and I were talking about this last Friday. But if you go back and read Deuteronomy 17, he breaks every warning given to the kings by Moses. And not just breaks them, he runs past them, right? You go from 6 wives to 1,000 women. You go from 150 horses and chariots with David, because it says not to have many, to thousands of horses and chariots. Like Solomon obliterates the warnings to
and then
kings.
spikes the ball when when he crosses the line.
Yeah, yeah. And so it's just interesting to see that and to understand all of that. As you say, it's all pointing us to Jesus and also pointing us to the fact that this brokenness is what all of us face, and Jesus is the only one that heals. And Jesus is the turning point in our redemption arc, right? He's the one that can take us from the case of being a transgressor to being one who's righteous. He's the way that happens. And it cannot happen without that, I think, is the thing to keep in mind.
Yeah.
All right, out of time. Thank you, guys.